Hello. So yes, I'm going to be talking about legacy plastics from oil and gas installations, and that's specifically relating in our case to the pipelines and umbilicals. So this is, we're currently in our second InSight project. We were running on a slightly different model to the main projects. We had our first phase last year where we had a 3-month desk-based phase, which was kind of set in the background and trying to work out what the priorities were for understanding plastics and decommissioning. And we're about halfway through, or coming towards the end of our second phase, which will end in September. And we're trying to dig a bit more into the detail around plastics and think about how we need to consider them with decommissioning. So I wanted to just start by setting the scene a little bit in terms of where we're at with our thinking around plastics from a scientific point of view, and also what the policy landscape looks a little bit like, because I think that's important in understanding how we're going to consider this and decommissioning moving forward. So there's a lot of scientific consensus around the potential harm that plastics can cause. We know that they're found in all marine environments, right from the poles to the equators and the deep seas as well. There's records in Arctic sea ice and in deep sea trenches. And if we're thinking about how we classify plastics, we can think about the macroplastics, so that's the big stuff. Microplastics, which are the ones less than 5 millimeters in diameter. And we also think that there will be potentially nanoplastics. The scientific consensus is out on that at the moment because it's such a hard area to research, but that is something that's an emerging area, and there's research happening to try and identify if we can find nanoplastics in the environment. But it's reasonable to assume that they would be there. And if we think about this from a point of view of pipelines and umbilicals, then clearly they start as macro, but we would assume that over time, over the long time scales, they would be degrading down into micro and potentially nanoplastic particles as well. But we know, especially when we're thinking about oil and gas, plastics are really useful. They're essential in our operations. They're very versatile, durable and persistent, so they're great materials to use in subsea environments, but that's also what makes them really difficult to actually to kind of remove in the environment. So once they're in there, the environmental conditions subsea are such that it's very difficult for degradation to happen, and we don't yet understand whether they can be assimilated back into nature or mineralised. And by that we mean whether they would break down enough to return to their constituent elements and therefore not be able to cause harm anymore. So there's lots that we do know about the potential for harm now, especially from the larger plastics and microplastics. There's lots of evidence that it can cause ecological harm, whether that's through ingestion or entanglement, and potential bioaccumulation of plastics within tissues, and also toxicological effects, so the chemicals associated with plastics leaching from them. And we've now found evidence that that is not only potentially harmful in the marine environment to marine life, but also to human health as well. There's evidence of plastics being found in things like human blood and placentas. There's also the potential for lots of economic impacts as well, loss to tourism revenue and fisheries impacts. And if we look at the picture up of the beach there's a lot of research that's been done which shows the well-being benefits that come from us spending time in the marine environment. And if we've got beaches that are covered in debris, then clearly that has detrimental effects on those benefits as well. And if we put this into the context of where we are with policy, at the moment there is definitely scientific consensus that we've got, if emissions of plastic were to remain as they are at the moment under business as usual scenarios, we might be reaching the point where within the next century we get to ecological levels of things like microplastic concentrations in particular, where they're going to be tipping over into levels that we would know would cause biological harm. So at the moment, especially with microplastics, the studies that have been done are mainly lab-based and using elevated concentrations of plastic to look at the potential harm that they could cause. The ecological levels, what's in the environment at the moment, hasn't yet reached that level, but there is scope for it to do so relatively quickly if we do continue under business as usual scenarios. So it's clear really from a scientific perspective that we should be taking action to reduce, prevent and mitigate plastic pollution in the marine environment. And this is a fundamental driver of the UN Plastics Treaty, which is under development at the moment, and it's going to be hopefully completed by the end of this year. We're going to reach some agreement on it by the end of this year, and it's likely to change the way that we address plastics, right from the development and the design of plastics right through to their end of life as well. So it's something that we need to be thinking about when we're thinking about decommissioning decisions in terms of how that policy landscape is shifting. So how is this all relevant to oil and gas? So we know plastics are fundamental. They're essential components of pipelines and umbilicals. They're used for protection and for insulation. And as such, they're kind of essential to energy security. We need them. But we do have decisions that can be made around decommissioning. So if they are all left in the marine environment, if we decommission in situ, then what are the risks of doing that? And how should they be considered in decommissioning? How do we incorporate that, our understanding of their potential impacts, especially in light of changing political environment as well? So overall, our project aim is to determine how consideration of the risk from plastic associated with oil and gas pipelines and umbilicals should be incorporated into future policy and planning for decommissioning. So we've got some priority questions that we are addressing as part of our second phase. First of all, we're trying to work out how much plastic is there, how much plastic is contained within oil and gas pipelines. Because they were put into the environment such a long time ago, the ones that are now being decommissioned, we don't have easy access to information about what polymers they contain and how much quantity of plastic might be there. So we're trying to get some better understanding of that. We're also trying to improve our understanding of timescales for degradation and how long these things might take to break down into microplastics and whether they might actually mineralise it. What do we know about that and what might the timescales be there? We're also looking at what the environmental risks are from those plastics in terms of their potential to cause harm from an ecological and also socioeconomic perspective and the impact of any chemical leachates. And then trying to build all this into how we actually think about this in risk assessments and decision making and what are the criteria that we need to be aware of in order for industry and policymakers and regulators to take this and actually think about how plastics should be set against other criteria. Clearly, it's not an easy decision. There's a huge amount that needs to go into decommissioning decision-making, and plastic is only a small part of that. But how do we make it more visible, and how do we consider it? So in our first phase, we did some estimation of the amount of plastic that is contained within pipelines and umbilicals, and this work was done for us by John Gillies from ExxonMobil, and he did some estimations based on data from the North Sea Transition Authority and understanding of what pipelines look like and what plastics might be within them. So from that, we've estimated that there might be approximately 120,000 tonnes of plastics contained within pipelines. 80,000 tonnes of that may be decommissioned in situ, and that is because we know that the pipelines that it is contained within are the ones that are hardest to remove. They're rigid pipelines for the most part, or they're buried, and that makes the decommissioning harder. It's likely that we would be choosing to leave those in situ, and a further 40,000 tonnes in umbilicals, which we would assume would be removed from the environment because that's a bit easier. So at the moment, we're working with John to try and work out if we can be more accurate with our estimates. There's some work that's been done as part of the EcoStar project at St Andrews by Maria Martins, where they've done an excellent database of all the pipelines that are present in the North Sea. And we're using that to try and improve our estimates. And we've also been lucky enough to get some samples through Shell of pipelines from the Brent area of the North Sea, and you can see a picture of that on the slide there. That's a cross-section through the pipeline, so we can use the information in that about what plastic we can see in there to work out a little bit better to try and improve those estimates so we can try and improve those estimates. So in our first phase as well, we used some work that's been done in Australia. This is work produced by Curtin University, and they have identified in Australian context what polymers are contained within pipelines and looked at modelling of different environmental parameters to look at degradation timescales. And it's clear that degradation will happen on a very long timescale. We think it'll be hundreds of thousands of years before these plastics might be microplastics and might potentially, whether we'd get to that point of mineralisation. So we are going to be looking a bit more in depth at this data and using environmental data from the UK situation to try and see whether these are realistic estimates for the UK as well. And also with the samples that I mentioned that we've got from the North Sea, we're going to be doing some work about chemical weathering to see what we can identify. We've started this work, but it's quite early days with it, so I haven't got any results to present to you at the moment, but we've got samples that have come either from pipelines that are laying on the seabed, so exposed to the water column, partially covered with concrete mattresses, or buried in the sediment, and we want to have a look and see if we can find evidence of chemical weathering that has occurred and how that might differ. And we can also use that then to critique those modelled timescales a little bit more. But when we're thinking about the environmental risks, I think we can all agree from the scientific consensus so far that there is potential for plastics associated with oil and gas, pipelines and umbilicals to cause harm, but it's how we actually frame that. So it's really difficult to take a fully risk-based approach to assessing risk in this way. If you take the example here, the plastic bottle, a whole plastic bottle might have harm in terms of economic and human well-being harm, but it's going to struggle to do harm to creatures unless they're really big, because they won't be able to ingest it. Once it's broken down into microplastics, then that's a different story. Then there's a much greater potential for harm to happen. And then once it's smaller and it can be assimilated by things like this scallop, then again, there's an even greater range of potential harm. And that includes economic harm through things like fisheries and also, which I think is quite important, public perception. If we start linking public perception and things like plastic being in fish and shellfish that we're eating, then that might have quite wide-ranging consequences. So we need to try and work out how plastics fit in and what it is, how much data do we need to get, and how far do we need to go with our risk assessments before we can start making decisions. And at the moment, we don't have the evidence base that we probably need, but we need to try and work out what that should look like. There's also the concept of essentiality, and this is something that is likely to be incorporated in the Plastics Treaty. So this is when we can look at items that are made of plastic and work out if they're essential in terms of for health, safety, and safety of society. So if we take the example of a plastic drinking straw, that's clearly not essential, and we've already seen that they've been banned, and we've moved on to things like metal and cardboard instead. But it's a very different story when we're thinking about pipelines. Clearly they are essential, but the key thing here is that they're essential while they're in use. And once they're no longer in use, so if we decommission in situ, then they start to fall into the category of being abandoned, and that's in the definition of marine litter. And that's where we might start to have things happening around, if they're classified as litter, should we be removing them from the environment? And also that's where the public perception comes in, I think, in terms of if the public were to think more broadly about this subject, then we might be in the situation where we see some public pressure in order to be making these, in order to be thinking a bit more about decommissioning and taking things out as well. So all of this is framing our thinking around how we're going to move forward. At the moment, we know that the processes of comparative analysis and environmental appraisal don't consider plastic that much. Clearly it would fit into quite a few of these principles, but in particular the environmental appraisal, it's hard at the moment because of the lack of robust evidence to make decisions on plastic. So hopefully the work that we're doing will be feeding into making that easier. But one of the key things that we're trying to do with this project is to actually formulate some decision-making support criteria. So using the research that we're doing, and then also with consultation with key stakeholders, so industry regulators and policymakers in particular, what do they need to know in order to consider plastics in decommissioning? What are the evidence gaps that they think are most important to fill in terms of shaping policy? And at the moment, we're starting that process. And if anyone here is interested in being involved, then we'd love to hear from you. So please reach out to one of us over the next couple of days, and we'd like to include you. We do have some future questions as well that we think are going to be key to addressing for this. So what can be done to minimise environmental accumulation of plastics? Questions around, can we design better? We know that we're going to be putting more pipelines and umbilicals in for oil and gas, but also more widely for other types of infrastructure. So with wind farms and everything like that, all of those cables and pipelines will be containing plastics. Can we do better in design in terms of being able to take them out again easily, or in terms of them not being potentially so damaging in terms of what plastic is made of? Are there options for compensation and mitigation in relation to materials that are having to be left in situ? And what's the scope for recycling? So we know that recycling does happen following decommissioning, but what does that really look like, and how easy is it, and how effective is it? What actually happens to this if it is removed and then taken for recycling? So hopefully this will form some of our thinking around the decision-making support criteria as well, and also hopefully into the future a bit more research. Okay, I forgot to say at the beginning that Richard Thompson and Freya Mendrick are also part of the team, and they're here today as well. And we're also working with a chemical expert in plastic degradation from America, Anthony Andrade. So if you want to talk to one of us, then Richard and Freya and myself are here for the next 2 days. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. It's clear that the argument for leaving or removing is not clear, that there are multiple sort of nuances there, and it'll be interesting to see how your findings come out of that. Can we move on to Natalie next, please? So this will be about the benthic impacts of marine structures. Thank you.
So I'll be taking us a little bit away from what we talked about in the first session, where we looked at what was going on the structures, and our project's really interested in understanding what the impacts are on the seabed itself. And so I'll be talking primarily about our NERC project FewComs, which is funded under Insight 2, and this is really focused on the oil and gas activity, but we're also interested in the renewables aspect, and we secured some additional funding under the same program, and that's the Orbit project, and so I'll talk a little bit about that too. So nevertheless, irrespective of which project we're talking about, the aim is pretty much the same. So we want to understand or determine the impact of these man-made structures, whether it's the presence, the placement, or the removal of them on the seabed, which is the large habitat around it. And we approach this in two different ways. So we've got a sort of large data analysis component within the FewComs project. And the view for that was to mine the existing data sets that have already been collected by industry over a number of decades. And also, of course, the collection of our own samples, so using a fieldwork and lab analysis campaign. And this is one of the challenges of working with industry data. Often it's being collected for survey purposes and not for scientific methodologies or for scientific questions in mind. And so we wanted to have some control over that by going out into the field and collecting our own data in a sort of scientific, robust way. Our funding actually arrived during the first lockdown, and as a very fieldwork-focused project, we had to really quickly think, and so we swapped our focus onto looking at the data initially. So I'll present some of that first. This is a paper that's just come out from one of our PhD students, Zelen Chen, and he was really interested in understanding the changes in species diversity around oil and gas platforms. And he wanted to see how that changed in terms of the food web and whether we can pick that up from existing industry data. So Zelen spent a significant amount of time looking at a number of different data sets, including UK benthos and some of the North Sea Transition Authority data sets, to get different species data. Each one of those species was assigned a trophic level, and then also looking at some of the environmental parameters that help us understand what some of those trends might mean. So he got 9 platforms going through this data set to find ones that had species data pre-construction and post-construction, but also the corresponding environmental parameters. And of course, since this data wasn't collected for scientific purposes, Zelen put his own experimental design on that data, which you can see here. So he used the hydrocarbon contaminations, or the concentration of hydrocarbons in the sediment, to impose his own regimes on them. So at the bottom here, we've got increasing distance away from these structures. And you can see the blue and the red line represent the concentrations of hydrocarbons in the sediment, and the blue is pre-construction, and the red is post-construction. So many of these platforms are still active at the time that the analyses were taken. And so he decided that between the 0 to 500 meter zone would be the impact zone, anything between 500 and 1500 is the buffer zone, and anything above 1500 is the sort of control zone, so what we're comparing things to. I'm just going to give a brief summary of what it is. There's a huge amount of species metrics and food web metrics within this, so if you are interested, please do go away and have a look at his paper in more detail. But in general, we're seeing within that impact zone, within the 500 meters of the platform, that we're seeing quite different food webs. We're seeing different species. There's a lot more opportunistic species. There's less diversity. And because there's less species and less trophic levels, we've got a more connected, simple food web. We also have an absence of many of the predator species. And as we move away into that buffer zone, we can see that start to change. We've got an increased diversity of the organisms within the sediment. We've got a more connected food web. Some of the higher trophic levels are coming back in. And then as we move into the control zone, it's pretty much what we'd expect for a benthic food web. So that's some of the work Zelen's been doing, and he's now looking at that same data to see what the implications of decommissioning might have on the same metrics. And then we had fieldwork campaigns, which formed a core part of our project. And so I'll talk firstly about the work we've done under FewComs, which is looking at decommissioned oil and gas platforms. And then I'll go on to some of the renewables work. Those of you who are familiar with our project, and at the same time that Dan did his work earlier, and I know Fishpans as well use the same sites, we focused our sediment sampling around 2 decommissioned platforms in the northern North Sea. So Northwest Hutton, which is a bit further to the north, sort of halfway between Shetland and Norway, and Miller Platform, which is a little bit further south. They both decommissioned at slightly different times. So Northwest Hutton is the older one that's been decommissioned. We collected these sediment samples in 2021, so over a decade after decommissioning, and Miller Platform decommissioning for that platform finished in 2018. So it's a lot newer site. And we sampled the sediment at northerly and southerly directions for both of those, 2 gradients, starting at 50 meters close to the platform and doubling that distance as we moved away, so 100, 200, and so on, up to 3.2 kilometers away, which became our control site. And we're using these sediment data, we use them for analysing pretty much everything we can think of. I think some collaborator called us milking everything we could out of the samples, and that's very much the approach we've taken. So biodiversity is one of the key things we wanted to really assess, and I'll present some of the macrofaunal data today. Ben will be talking after me, and he'll talk a bit more about some of the microbiology and the eDNA, but also some of the chemistry linked to that too. So there's a lot of talk for eDNA, but we believe as well we need to have those traditional approaches, so using the taxonomy to pick through the samples and see what's actually there before we can look at whether a genomics approach would align quite nicely with that. This is work that was led by Dave Patterson's group at St Andrews, and one of his members of the team has spent hours, days, weeks picking through the different samples, sieving through them to see what's there. And I'll start by showing you some of the changes of the relative abundance of the main genera, the macrofauna genera. This is platform Miller. So along the x-axis at the bottom, we've got increasing distance moving away from the platform, and the different colors represent different organisms with different genus at this time, and the extent of that color shows the relative abundance. And we can see there's slightly different communities. Closer to the structure, it's a bit different to what we see as we move away, and as we move away from the structure, those communities become more similar to what we see at the control site. So, for example, echinocardium is in lower relative abundance quite close to the platform, and we know that's linked to its tolerance. It tends to be relatively intolerant of pollution through metals or hydrocarbons. And the same we see with the Polychaete serratulus. And in fact, the blue you can pick out really clearly is present at 50 meters, a little bit present still at 100 meters, and then disappears as we move away from the platform. And when we look at the same data for Northwest Hutton, we can see a similar trend. We've got slightly different colors representing different species, but closer to the platform, we've got a different community at 50 meters compared to as we move further away. And as we move further away, some of those colors shift. And as we get closer to that control site, we see the structure of the macrofaunal biodiversity starts to return to what we deem background levels. Of course, some of this is underpinned by what's happening in the geochemistry as well, and Ben will talk a bit about that, and it links to sediment types too. So these are just images taken from some of those samples that Mel was able to sieve through. But of course, we're really interested in understanding other things that the seabed provides, and we do a lot of work on blue carbon or carbon sequestration and storage, and one of our PhD students, Hugo, has been focusing his efforts on understanding how that might change around some of these man-made structures. When we wrote the project 5 years ago, we had the idealistic view of getting into active platforms when they still have that 500-meter exclusion zone. So we don't have those samples, but we do have some that have come out of after decommissioning. So we're kind of disentangling what's the result of decommissioning and what might be the actual background levels. So Hugo's paper is under review at the moment, and he quantified the carbon stock, so he looked at how much carbon there was. We used radiochemistry to estimate burial rates as well, but I won't be presenting that today. And so starting with Miller, again, we've got the increasing gradient moving away from the platform starting at 50 meters. The different colors represent the two transects, and you can see they're relatively similar. We've got an increase in the total carbon stock closer to the structure, and then that drops to relatively low levels, which is consistent across that gradient. And when we have a look at the same data for Northwest Hutton, we can see there's a lot more carbon within it. It appears to be a little bit more consistent. There's some variability at 200 and 400 meters, but nevertheless, we've got quite different carbon dynamics between the two sites. And some of that is driven by what's happening at the sites and what the type of sediment is. So Hugo had a look at what the sediment's made up of. So mud and sand are two terms that benthic biogeochemists love, and for us it's very important. I realise for most people that proportion of mud and sand is not quite so important. But it does have a correlation to what we'd expect to see in the carbon content. So this is Miller, and remember when I talked about the Miller carbon dynamics, we saw quite a lot of carbon stock quite close to the platform. That's partly driven by the finer particles, so we've got more mud content closer at 50 meters, and then it drops back to really small amount of mud, and it's basically a sandy sediment site. And so when you look at the sand content, which is in the lower plot, you can see it's pretty much the mirror image of what we see in the mud. So it's a sandier, more permeable sediment, and that pretty much represents what we have on most of our continental shelf sediments. Northwest Hutton was different. It was a nice muddier site. That's this perfect kind of mud that our group liked to work with. But nevertheless, we do see a slight trend, and closer to the platform, it's a little bit muddier than the background levels before returning to pretty much a flat line and what we'd expect. Okay, I'm not going to talk any more about the decommission stuff, and Ben's going to pick this up in the next talk, but I'd like to chat a little bit about some of the work we've been doing in active wind farms too. So working closely with Ørsted, we swapped our focus to looking at renewables. Brilliant, thank you. And so we went out October last year after about a year or so of wrangling around different vessel options and how to get into the wind farm and what we're going to be using and deploying, etc. We went out in October last year. This time we were on board the vessel ourselves, collecting our own sediment samples. We were able to take a sediment profile imager with us as well, which is this nice bit of kit in the middle, belongs to CFAS. And that's a camera system that partially penetrates the seabed and takes a photo, so you get a nice image showing you what the sediment looks like, what animals might be living there. It tells you a little bit about the redox as well, and just some really nice visuals. Excitedly for us, we were given access to go within the farm, and so we were able to go inside the farm and sample there. So we have 3 sites within the farm, and then we sampled at transects away from the structure as well. We had an idealized 3 gradients, which we didn't quite get, but that's fine. So we've got inside 50 meters away from the footprint of the farm, 400 meters, and then a reference site again at 3.2 kilometers. And we thought this would give us a little bit of data to start comparing the difference between the impacts of oil and gas, where we can see hydrocarbons have quite a big effect on what we're seeing in the seabed, and also offshore wind, where we don't have quite that same hydrocarbon contaminants. Once again, we are still in the process of milking those samples for pretty much all the data we can. Biodiversity, again, is a big aspect, so I'll talk you through some of the initial macrofauna results that have come from Dave's group again. The microbial aspect will be covered a bit more detail this afternoon in Corinne's talk. And of course, the geochemistry, the metals are really important for understanding around wind farms too. We also were able to bring some sediment back in the lab, and we set up a small mesocosm experiment to control the conditions and the types of metals added to sediments to see how that influences some of the services, such as the remediation driven by the microbial communities. So in terms of what macrofauna we're finding at the site, so Barrow is one of the oldest wind farms in the UK. It's about 20 years now since it's been commissioned, so we'd expect to see some changes or perhaps a return to what it was pre-construction. These are some of the images that Mel's produced from her sample. She's probably about halfway through. She's got another half to sort through. Days at the microscope. She's got a lot more patience than I do, but also a skill for doing it. And we can see there's quite a wide diversity in the different organisms that we're seeing. These are also taken from Barrow samples, and these are images from our bioimaging facility at Essex. I think they're quite beautiful for seeing some of the detail we don't often see on the species. I particularly like the tube worm on the far left, where you can see the individual sediment particles in the tube. I think that's pretty cool. Anyway, irrespective of that, we are starting to be able to pick out some trends. So we can see that Amphiurophiliformis is really dominant species here. When we look back at the pre-construction and post-construction surveys, we can see that that was present pre-construction and not in the post-construction survey. So whether that indicates perhaps they're returning to the area, the environment's maybe gone back the same, maybe the sediments changed a little bit. We're seeing some dominant other species as well. What we are clearly seeing are differences in the sediment type too. And so we're just unpicking at the moment whether that's what it always has been or if that's a result of having the structures there as well. So there's a lot more work to go through on this, and if you are interested, please do come and see Corinne's talk. She'll be presenting some of the work Hayley, our PhD student, has been doing on the microbial aspect too. And of course, we've got all this data, and it's not just an academic output. We're looking at using that, using different models or tools to sort of expand that. Chris will talk a bit later about some of the food web work he's doing, but we're also looking at plugging some of this data into models that already exist. So the spatially managed marine area toolkit, which is the smart spatial tool that CFAS have. And that allows you to sort of predict what impacts might have on certain aspects of the seabed. So this is a recent DEFRA report that came out, and what you can see here, the different colors on the seabed itself are the carbon vulnerability, and you can use it for things like carbon sequestration, biodiversity. And then the little cutout sort of diagonal things are red for MPAs, marine protected areas, and the pinks are the offshore wind. And so effectively, if you know how the seabed is changing in response to something such as the presence of an offshore wind farm, what that means for the biodiversity, you can then start to layer that into the model and say, okay, if we put a wind farm here, how does that affect biodiversity? If we move over here, do we see changes in carbon sequestration? And that has been used recently for looking at where we put offshore wind farms, how that impacts catch as well. So there's an economic linkers there. So we've done quite a lot of work so far. We've still got quite a bit to come, so please watch this space. Happy to take any questions on email if anyone doesn't want to ask them today. These are the names of all the academic collaborators that have been involved, but we've been hugely supported by a number of industry partners too. So thank you very much.